Hi, everyone. My name is Jake Marcinko. I'm a Senior Technical Product Manager for the Council. And in addition to being responsible for the software, key management, and card production standards and programs, I'm also one of the internal champions for the Council's Standards Modernization Initiative. So during today's session, what I want to do is, first I want to explain what the standards modernization effort is. I want to talk a little bit about why it's important. And then I also want to explain what we hope to achieve with the standards modernization effort. But before we can really address these questions, we really need to explain how the Council's proverbial sausage is made. In other words, we need to make sure that you understand what the process is for how standards and the supporting documentation are brought to market. So anyone here US-based, just out of curiosity? I know you are. And I know you recognize this, right? Anyone who is not US-based recognize this character? Yeah. So obviously this resonates much better in the US. But so there was, in the 1980s, there was a children's show called Schoolhouse Rock that would teach young children complex concepts. And one of those concepts was how a bill becomes a law in the US. And so there was this cartoon, and the cartoon character was named Bill. This is not Bill, however, this is standard. And the reason why I wanted to use this as an example is that the way a bill becomes a law in the US is, or the way a standard becomes a standard in the Council is very similar to how a bill becomes a law in the US. Like a bill, there are multiple steps that a standard must go through before it can be published. The standards typically start out or originate within PCI SSC working groups, and I see a couple of working group members in the room. The working groups develop and or refine internal drafts until they can reach consensus on a version of a standard that they want to submit to the RFC. Once we get internal approval to go to RFC, then the draft documents are shared with our participating other organizations and other key stakeholders through the PCI portal. How many folks in the room here have participated in RFC before? Okay. 65, 70%. That'll make Andrew happy. So then once it's posted to the portal, the RFC participants will download those documents. Then they'll submit their ideas and feedbacks for how to improve or identify challenges with certain standards, and then they'll convey that information back to the Council. We then collate that feedback and we share and review it with the working groups. The working group then considers whether and or how to incorporate the feedback into a subsequent revised draft for a second or a follow-up RFC. Now the whole process repeats itself until we finally get to a version that the Council and the working groups are ready to publish. However, before the standard can actually be published to the website, it has to go through a series of internal approvals. Once it achieves those approvals, the standard is obviously then published to the PCI SSC website for general consumption. Now that we understand the general process for how standards are brought to market, let's look at some of the specific ingredients that go into producing a standard. Now, most of our standards and documentation starts out as a Microsoft Word document. We then take that document and convert it to PDF before we either submit it to RFC via the portal or we submit it for internal approval to be published as a PDF document on the PCI SSC website. This is a method that's worked for years. Many other standards bodies have done the same process in the past. However, this approach is becoming more challenging, particularly in modern times. And one such challenge with this approach is data loss. So converting from one proprietary format to, let's be real, PDF is another proprietary format, even though they have standardized on the PDF format. It's still going from a proprietary format to an open format. And sometimes when you go through the conversion process, there's data loss. Things like headers, fonts, footers, other formatting elements, they do not always convert well. And while the loss of certain formatting elements may not seem like a big problem, when you lose things like semantic enrichment elements, and so these are things like bookmarks, hyperlinks, footnotes, defined terms or links to defined terms, that is a lot more problematic than simply losing a font or losing some images. The second issue has to do with usability, and then there are actually two sub-issues related to usability: accessibility and interpretability. And I think there's one page in PCI DSS version 4.0.1 that I think does a brilliant job of illustrating both of these issues. And that's this page. How many folks are familiar with this page? Okay, that's not bad. So this is actually what I think is one of the best pages in any of our standards in terms of this is an excellent example of how to enrich a document with some additional semantic context. So there are all these, basically bubble text here that explains to you exactly what each of the headings is intended to convey. And so this is really, it's providing contextual information and metadata to help improve your understanding of how the requirements are laid out and what the intent is and how the different information is presented. However, this presents a number of issues. Let's look at some specific examples. First and foremost, our standards assume that humans are really the only users of our standards. However, with increased adoption of automation and AI, that is no longer a reasonable assumption. Computers often struggle to process things, particularly in things like images. And applying metadata concepts described here to the rest of the document can be challenging for computers to do. This page is also very challenging for folks with disabilities. For example, note that there's the different bubbles have different colors, but these are very minor color variations that have specific meaning. However, for somebody who's colorblind, they can't not only differentiate between these subtle color differences, but they may not be able to understand what the meanings of these different bullets are. And the use of high density or highly complex layouts, that's really a challenge for folks with autism or dyslexia to process. Users with dyslexia also struggle to remember things from previous pages and then trying to apply those concepts there to pages later in the document. So what's the solution? Well, the solution is XML. That's the answer, putting our documents in a standardized open format. And from there are so many different things that we can do. However, one of the challenges that we have at the council is not all of our authors are former or current coders. So we have to come up with a way to allow our authors to continue to work in tool sets that they're familiar with while still providing a source document in XML format. So where are we right now? We are currently evaluating ways that we can leverage things like third-party tools or scripts to extract the information that's created in a Word document and simultaneously generate, either simultaneously or shortly after the initial creation of the document, generate XML without requiring our authors to write XML natively. Now, once we have an XML source document, it's much easier to convert to other formats. And this is achievable because instead of going from a proprietary format to another format, we're going from an open machine-readable format to another format. And then, like I said, this paves the way for us to do so many different things like streamlining and automating our publication process, improving support for accessibility features, and making our documentation perhaps even more interactive. So where are we today in terms of this effort? Well, we're really at the beginning phases. We're starting with PCI DSS 4.0.1 as part of an initial pilot. Now, some of you might be asking, why are you taking one of the most complex and biggest standards that you deal with as part of the initial pilot? And the reasoning for that is because of its complexity. Our idea is that if we can figure out how to generate an XML document from a document, the current PCI DSS version 4.0.1, or a maybe less formatted version of that, then we can solve probably any other problem that we're likely to come across. So, as I mentioned, we're in the process of analyzing the different contexts of information in PCI DSS and then mapping those to a set of either semantic or custom XML tags to create an initial XML version of PCI DSS 4.0.1. This custom schema or XML will then act as our baseline for all of our documentation, because the idea is we can identify the contextual elements in PCI DSS, we can compare those to other contextual elements in other PCI SSC documentation, and then standardize on a set of tags or elements. And then from there, we can effectively map to any other XML schema of choice, whether that's like the NISO STS, that's NIST OSCAL. It's much easier to go from a standardized set of tags to any other XML schema. We could also go to other formats like JSON. We can convert from XML back to PDF without having to rely on other tools. Now, in terms of timelines, let me first preface this by saying this is subject to change. However, we are on track to produce an XML version of PCI DSS version 4 before the end of the year. And what we're hoping to do is share that with some of our stakeholders, like our technology guidance group, for initial feedback that we can then use that information to start working on other documents or enhancing the XML version of PCI DSS. So that's phase one. We're also using phase one to start to identify which processes that we can rely on and that we might leverage in the future. Phase two, we're going to look at expanding support, expanding the efforts to generate XML to not only other PCI SSC standards, for example, potentially could be PTS, could be the new software, the two new software standards that are scheduled for release at the beginning of next year, but it will also include the ROC, PCI DSS ROC, and AOC. We are looking to provide XML versions of the PCI DSS ROC and AOC. And then phase three, which is really scheduled for latter part of next year, that's where we'll start to look at adding support for other XML schemas like the NISO STS. Now, it's likely that additional phases will be added to this initiative. This is not something, although it seems rather simple, it is not something that's we're going to be able to process very quickly. We want to be methodical in how we're approaching this. So we're likely to extend these time, not so much these phases, but extend additional phases onto this effort. However, we're really, like I said, we're really just getting started. So if you have any questions, recommendations, requests that you would like to see in terms of XML versions of our documentation, please either email them to this address on the screen, or come see myself or Andrew at the booth or anywhere else around during the conference, and we'll be happy to address your questions, concerns, or take your feedback and factor that into this effort. And we'll respond to you. If you do submit your comments via email, both Andrew and I get that feedback. We'll respond to your comments as soon as we can. And with that, thank you for your time today. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thanks, everyone.